Good afternoon and welcome to the Department of Behavioral Health's weekly update. It is April 15th. This is usually tax day, but this year, because of the COVID pandemic, that's been pushed into May for people like me who have to pay taxes. That's one more month that money doesn't come out of my bank account. All right. April is also Alcohol and Stress Awareness Month. We sent out yesterday an email with a nice video. I think we can all appreciate that we've collectively experienced a lot of stress the last year, so please take advantage of the resources offered through the video and keep in mind for yourself and your loved ones that it's always good to take care of yourself. All right, on to the numbers. COVID in the world is up to 138,662,000 and now approaching 3 million worldwide deaths. Of note, and we'll talk about how things are here in Fresno, but we are beginning to see some surges again across the world. Brazil has been experiencing one for some time now, as has India. Of note for both of those countries, unfortunately, they have not had a lot of vaccinations like we have in the United States. So that is very much a concern. And we talked about this previously. It's very easy to become a little microscopic and just look at what's happening in our neck of the woods and worry about ourselves and whether or not we get to return to the freedoms we had previously. But the more the virus spreads across the world, the more chance that variants emerge that are harder for the vaccines and such to manage. And so it's really in our best interest to support efforts to vaccinate across the world. There is an initiative called the COVAX initiative, and it's an effort to bring vaccines to underserved parts of the world. And the United States is making some vaccine available through that COVAX initiative, and a lot of pressure is being put on right now by some of the manufacturers to make sure that vaccines are available to underserved parts of the world as well. We're also seeing a lockdown continue in France. We're seeing an increase in Puerto Rico. And interestingly enough, Canada, for the first time in the pandemic, Canada has a higher rate per capita than the United States. And they're vaccinating at a slower rate as well. And one of the reasons perhaps that they're not doing quite as well with vaccinations is they don't really have vaccine production capability. So they've had to rely solely on purchasing vaccines. So kind of interesting. Okay, what's happening in the United States? We have 31,447,000 cases of COVID and now 565,000 deaths due to COVID across the United States. In California, over 3.6 million cases, over 59,500 deaths. We have done almost 57 million tests, which is kind of interesting, and 24 million vaccinations. The positivity rate of our tests in the last 7 days is about 1.7%, very close to last week when it was 1.8%, really low number. Again, a reminder that you really have to get under that 1% to consider that a virus is really under control, so we're not quite there yet. In terms of Fresno County, we have now passed the 100,000 mark in terms of cases of COVID, known cases of COVID, and over 1,600 deaths at 1,640 deaths. And then hospitalizations continue to come down. We've been kind of hovering in the mid-80s the last several days. We're up to 89 as of yesterday, 25 individuals in the ICU, and only 11 ICU beds. So again, that constant reminder to us that COVID is not the only reason people end up in the ICU, but when you have COVID and people are in the ICU, it limits capacity for all other uses of the ICU. In terms of our tier, I'm really happy to report we remain in the red tier, but this week we're in the orange tier for all of the metrics. So for the first time in a long time, maybe even since the metrics came about, the tiers came about, we're both in positivity at 3.5%. Remember, we have to be under 5% for positivity to stay in the orange, and 5.9 cases per 100,000 population. They adjusted this a little bit, but essentially we have to be, it used to say 4 to 10, and I haven't fixed my slide, and now I believe it's 6 to 10. So they made it a little easier to get into the orange tier. So being in the orange tier, if we can stay in the orange tier next week, we should come out of the red tier and firmly go into the orange tier. And basically what that means is just more capacity in restaurants and stores and things like that, a few more things that open. All right. I wanted to show you a picture of the state again. We now have the bulk of the state either in red or orange. We're right in the middle there in the red, but hopefully by next week we'll see a more orange state representing our state flower, the poppy, hopefully. But anyhow, Merced was the last county to come out of the purple tier, and there was some sort of adjustment made between Tuesday and or Monday and Tuesday where they were in the purple and now they're in the red tier. So they were the last state to come out of the purple tier. All right, in terms of vaccinations, we're now up to 549,533 vaccinations, and this is a couple of days old, so it's even higher, and we continue down that path of now we have more people fully vaccinated, almost 200,000 fully vaccinated, and a little over 131,500 who are partially vaccinated. When you look at about 28.6% of our population overall, that includes people who aren't eligible for the vaccine, have been vaccinated. And keep in mind, when we talk about herd immunity, that's the population we're talking about, everybody. Even if they're not eligible to get vaccinated because we don't have a vaccine for people under 16, they have to be included to get to herd immunity. And so we're at 28.6% vaccinated. And then 37.4% of those over the age of 16 have been vaccinated. So a little more than a third of the population eligible has been vaccinated. We're really only 1 week in, though, on that broader population, so we should expect to see that number go up. All right. And in terms of that vulnerable population of people over the age of 65, we're now over 76%. That's an increase of almost 6% since last week. So we'll continue to chip away at that population, really, really working hard to get that vulnerable population of the elderly vaccinated, because they're the ones most likely to suffer more severe consequences and die of COVID. All right. I wanted to give you a little background on testing. I talked a little earlier about how many millions of tests. We've now done over 1.1 million tests in Fresno County. And in the last 7 days, 2.7% is our positivity rate. So that's even an improvement from our tier. So the tier is a little bit in arrears. And so in the last 7 days, we're even better at 2.7%. And of that, population, there was some work done to really understand who has been getting COVID and how have they been getting it. And the majority, that upper left shows you it's from their household. So certainly, you know, a lot of our precautions are for outside the house, but we know that you're much more likely if you live with someone with COVID to get COVID. But another, 40% or so is outside the house. So, very important to continue with those precautions. And then this slide shows you that since, in terms of all tests that have been done, the darker the color on the left side, that they have a higher number of positive tests. And that lower left portion really is representative of some of our state prisons where they've had a huge number, in Kalinga largely, a huge number of positive cases, kind of over-representing Fresno County. But when you look at the last 30 days, they are largely in our metropolitan area. And that's the graphic on the right. So the left-hand side is all tests since the beginning, and on the right-hand side is in the last 30 days. And last week we talked about mortality across the United States and really looked at what COVID has contributed in terms of overall mortality. And really from that perspective, you often hear people say, oh, they'll say you died of COVID no matter what you died of, and the death certificates are lies. Hospitals make more money if they say someone had COVID. And so this review kind of gives us a chance to really look at the actual facts. So if, for instance, we saw that the number of deaths in 2020 was no different than prior years, it would be accurate to say that while COVID was listed as a cause of death, it didn't significantly impact deaths in our county. I had presented this slide previously, so I reintroduced it to show you that when you looked at the leading causes of death in the several years prior to COVID, we had at that time about 711 deaths attributed to COVID in 2020, and showed it as about the third most common cause of death. So clearly indicating that likely we were going to see an impact on overall death. So this next slide does show you, if you look on the left-hand side, we saw a similar graph last week that comprised all of the United States. This is just Fresno County. And so the blue line on the lower is the average for the years of 2017 through 2019, so for the 3 years prior to COVID. And then the orange or top line is the deaths during the time of COVID. So all deaths, not just COVID deaths, it's every death. And so on average, between 2017 and 2019, we had 7,025 deaths each year in the county of Fresno for all causes. That encompasses accidental deaths, overdoses, death by suicide, homicide, heart disease, cancer, you name it, everything is in there. In 2020, we had 8,706 deaths. That's 1,681 deaths more than the average, and about 1,638 deaths more than the highest year of deaths, which was 2018 in that 3-year period. So we thought we had 711 deaths or so, probably a little higher, when all is said and done, that were attributed to COVID for 2020. And we had over 1,600 additional deaths than we've experienced in prior years. So pretty definitively, it would be not factual to say that experiencing the pandemic had no impact on overall deaths. Significantly higher deaths. Significantly higher deaths. Something like 25 to 30% higher deaths last year than in prior years. And we know that some of those deaths were due to COVID, but even the known COVID deaths don't account for all deaths. There's twice as many additional deaths than deaths due to COVID. So likely we were underreporting COVID deaths. So just something to keep in mind. All right, in terms of vaccines, I thought today I would really focus on Johnson & Johnson. There's a lot in the news about Johnson & Johnson. There's been a pause in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and so we're going to go over today why we've had that pause and what that means. So a couple of days ago, the CDC announced that there would be a pause on the vaccine administered by Johnson & Johnson. That's the 1-dose vaccine. This is the vaccine that we've been utilizing at our clinic. And it was based on a report of 6 cases of a rare blood clotting disorder or blood clots in the brain. It's kind of an interesting thing. There's blood clots, but also increased bleeding, which is kind of counterintuitive, and that's why it's kind of rare. It's an interesting set of circumstances. Yesterday, 2 more cases were added. One of someone who had been vaccinated since the vaccination started on a wholesale scale, and one who had been part of the trial. The symptoms typically have developed 6 to 13 days after vaccination, very, very distinct and different from the post-vaccination symptoms that many people have experienced, the sore arm, fatigue, nausea, headache, or fever, etc. This is severe headache, abdominal and or leg pain, and shortness of breath, all associated with blood clot, the blood clot occurring in the brain. And of the 8 people, 7 of them had that blood clot in the brain. The 7 of the 8 were women between the ages of 18 and 48. One of the 6 who were identified did die, and one is hospitalized in critical condition. Obviously, even though this is a very, very rare complication, and my next slide will show this, this is 6 to 8 cases, and maybe more, we'll talk about that, out of 7.4 million doses of vaccine. Really, really tiny incidence rate, but significant outcome if someone gets it. So why would they pause? That's one reason. They want to gather additional information. There has been 7.4 million doses prior to the pause, so what they want to do, pauses are common in vaccine trials and after vaccines begin to be administered. We talked about this previously, and when vaccines go through the trial process, and this includes traditional vaccine processes as well as the COVID vaccines, and there's been a lot of speculation and misinformation and conspiracy theories about these vaccines didn't go through the proper process, it happened too fast, we can't trust them. That's actually not true. They went through all the proper process, they just were accelerated for 2 reasons. Again, one, because a lot of money was given, which accelerates their ability to do certain things in the process. But 2, because of the prevalence of COVID, you had enough people in the control group who got COVID to demonstrate whether or not the vaccine was effective in preventing COVID in those who were vaccinated. The other thing that happens with all vaccines, they take longer because they're not funded in the same way typically, and they don't have that period of time that people rapidly get the virus who were not vaccinated. But because they take longer, there's a longer period of time to study some of the effects. And so in the original trials, you did have that one person who developed this problem, but this problem occurs outside of vaccination. So as we talked about previously when we were talking about the AstraZeneca vaccine, you're measuring whether or not the incidence of this problem is greater than it occurs in the general population. And so in traditional vaccine trials, there's enough people in the trial to identify what we would say is non-rare occurrences. So things like, yep, we knew when you got the vaccine you'd have some post-vaccination symptoms, but there was no other incidents that occurred in a big enough number to demonstrate that the vaccine caused a bad outcome. When you start mass vaccinations, when you're vaccinating hundreds of thousands, now millions and hundreds of millions of people, you begin to see, all vaccines, all drug trials, you begin to see those very, very rare outcomes, okay? So 6 out of 7 million, for instance. And now you do have to pay attention to that. It can absolutely be because of the vaccine, but it's exceedingly rare. And so the types of things they do in a pause is first they measure, is this incidence occurring at a higher rate than we would expect in the general population? And this can be challenging if the general population is very rare as well. And this is a unique kind of blood clotting disorder that is exceedingly rare in the general population. And so you might not be able to tell until you have enough cases whether or not it's a higher rate than what you would expect. Very preliminarily, they think it may be a higher rate than what you would expect in the general population. The other thing they want to do, particularly because the symptoms develop, a bit past the vaccination point. So around, on average, 2 weeks from the time of vaccination is when the symptoms can develop. So somewhere around 5 to 14 days or so. And so they want to make sure that there aren't additional cases that haven't been identified or recognized as possibly being related to the administration of the vaccine. And so this pause gives them time to, send out alerts and tell people, doctors and hospitals and the people who've gotten the vaccine, did you have any of these symptoms? How can you report to us so we understand it might have been from the vaccine? That additional information will give them even more ability to say, is this normal or not normal? It will also allow time for them to identify, are there particular populations for whom this would not be the best vaccine? And are there treatments that we want to make sure that people who get the vaccine know that if they develop these symptoms, they tell their doctor right away, and that the doctors are aware that this is a known possible complication of the vaccine, and here's the treatment you need to administer. In this particular type of blood clotting disorder, a traditional treatment that you would give for blood clots, you would not want to give. And so it could possibly make it worse. And so that's why they want to kind of pause and make sure that if they determine that there is a risk, it is an infinitesimal risk, teeny tiny risk. Likely they will reinstate the vaccine, but they will make sure that people understand this is a possible risk, and if this happens, seek help, and for the help that they go to seek, that they would know how to treat it. Recognize it as a known complication and have the resources at hand to treat it. Okay. The symptoms for these particular cases are very similar to those found with the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's another reason for the pause. Both of these vaccines are what we call viral vector vaccines, and I've talked about this before, so I won't repeat it, other than to say they both use an adenovirus as the vector to deliver the vaccine. So this is a virus that doesn't cause illness in people, and they use this adenovirus, inject it, take the mRNA, very similar to the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, but essentially to take the message to your RNA how to produce this protein, very similar to the mRNAs, for your body to recognize, see it as foreign, develop the antibodies. And so the kinds of things that they'll be looking at as well are these similarities because of the adenovirus viral vector vaccine? And some of the potential causes that they'll be investigating are there underlying conditions in the people who had the complication that would contribute to them getting it? Obviously, and I'll just use as an example, let's say if you had high blood pressure, you were more likely to have it. You would not want to give the vaccine to people with high blood pressure, or you'd want to advise them. Very similar to what we had when we first started with the mRNA vaccines, where we knew people who'd had an allergic response might have an allergic response to these vaccines, so we'd want to be on the lookout. Not necessarily to tell them you can't get it, but we're going to be on the lookout, we're going to observe you for 15 minutes, and if we see that, we're going to have the right resources on hand to treat you for that allergic response. The other thing is they want to see if it's an immune reaction. Is there something going on here in terms of the body's immune response that we want when we give you a vaccine that's causing this problem? And or is there a biological trait that in certain people with a certain DNA structure, this immune response results in this strange clotting condition? So those are the types of things they look at, and that is what would help guide them to say, we don't advise this vaccine for these people, or watch out for this complication and here's how to treat it. One of the things they looked at with the AstraZeneca, where they're a little further along, is they saw the clotting more in women. And it's also been seen in women with Johnson & Johnson. And so you might first say, oh, there's something about women. But what they found was more women had been given the AstraZeneca vaccination because there's more women who are healthcare workers, and healthcare workers were prioritized in that first round. So they actually discovered that no, it's not just women getting it, and not necessarily a higher proportion of women. So it's very easy to jump to conclusions with limited information. And that's why it's really, really important to go through the whole scientific process. And this is what happens with every vaccine. Even vaccines that have been approved in the past, over time, you find these very rare reactions or complications, and you just have to figure them out and then address them. And keeping in mind, if someone were to develop this type of response, there are treatments. And so that's why it's so important during this pause to understand, recognize, educate healthcare providers so that if this very, very, very rare 1 in a million thing happens, that they're prepared to recognize it and to treat it. All right, that's my science lesson for the day. All right, so our clinics for people experiencing homelessness and people in our system of care have been paused because we were delivering the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And we are going to go ahead likely next week and resume those clinics and just offer the 2-dose vaccinations. Now, the reason we've been offering the 1 dose to those populations when they became, it was kind of coincidental that the 1-dose vaccine became available when we got to the tier for which our populations could get the vaccine. And we felt that the 1-dose vaccine was preferable because sometimes, particularly for people experiencing homelessness, it might be hard to find them, to get them to come in. And it might be difficult for people who we serve to come back for a second dose. However, keep in mind that, and I reported this last week, so I'll just repeat it here, Moderna and Pfizer, which are our 2-dose vaccines, have about 80% effectiveness after the first dose. The 1-dose Johnson & Johnson has 85% effectiveness. So if we give them the 2-dose vaccine, and for whatever reason they aren't able to get back to us for the second dose, they'll at least have that 80%. So we're going to proceed forward with those 2-dose vaccines, but we will resume with Johnson & Johnson when the CDC gives us that guidance. All right, because I presume it will be asked, I just want to talk a little bit about return to in-office work and in-person services. Fresno County did on Tuesday, the Board of Supervisors lifted or ended the emergency order for governmental services. And so that happened on Tuesday. They did not lift, and they cannot lift, actually, the healthcare order. Only our health officer can lift that. So that remains in place. But the disruption to government services has ended. So, it's not necessarily going to change what we do at all. It's just going to begin to kind of create that momentum for all departments of the county to resume what we'll call normal operations with precautions. So I do want to emphasize that staff should prepare, they should begin those preparations for an in-office return to work. You're currently working, but an in-office work setting. And so whatever supports you typically have needed in order to come to the office, to do your job, you should begin to make those arrangements and set things up so that when we're ready to come back to the office, that you're ready to do so as well. In the meantime, we're continuing our planning for a safe return. As I've stated before, and I'm committed to, we're going to have a detailed plan. You'll know by building, by room, etc., what kind of occupancy, under what circumstances. We'll be getting input on that plan from public health and our teams and staff. And we'll give you at least a couple of week notice before we say, okay, it's time for you to come to work if you've been traditionally working at home. Now again, at any given time, any of our employees who are working from home based on business need could be asked to return to work. And that's really another good reason to have your preparations in order, to kind of be poised at all times, to come back to the work setting based on business need. And so I really want to encourage all of you to begin that process so you aren't taken unawares, and we'll continue the work we're doing, keep communicating with you and letting you know where we're at in the process, and give you some advance notice before it happens on a formal, widespread basis. Okay. With that, I think I'm going to take questions. I keep in my presentation all the things I've said previously about the measures we're going to take, and if questions come up about that, I'll review them again, but otherwise, we've already covered that. All right, someone read today that demand for vaccinations are declining and some shot clinics are already closing due to low demand, and to tell your friends and family to get their shots. Yes, absolutely. We've been pushing really, really hard. They opened up the clinics early even. Officially today was the day 16 and over, but in Fresno County, we opened up to that last week. And so we really, our capacity to deliver vaccines is greater than demand right now, it seems like. And I'm sure when people hear things like the Johnson & Johnson incidents, that creates some vaccine hesitancy. I really can't emphasize to you enough. A handful of incidents in 7 million vaccinations is a really, really low incidence. I mean, you're more likely practically to be in a tornado or hit by a meteorite, and so, or be in a car crash. And more importantly, your chance of becoming gravely ill or dying of COVID is higher than the risks of getting the vaccine. Every person has to make that decision for themselves, but again, make that decision based on facts. And make sure you share that facts with friends and family who are reluctant to get the vaccine. I've shared this before. I have family members who are reluctant to get the vaccine, and so I'm always careful to just share with them the actual facts. And also encourage them that the sooner we get to the point where we have herd immunity, the sooner we can get past all of these restrictions on our personal freedoms. And so, and make sure we don't cause massive problems at hospitals and healthcare facilities. And so stick with the facts. Another thing. Then there's how close the incident of clotting post-vaccination is to the incidence of clotting in the general population. Yeah, as I stated, that's one of the things they look at is, if it's 1 in 1.5 million in the general population, and they find that this is 1 in 1 million, then it is more common post-vaccination than in the general population, and you can begin to make that connection between getting the vaccine and developing this clotting disorder. As I've stated previously, people can get the vaccine and have a heart attack. People can get the vaccine and be diagnosed with cancer. That doesn't mean the vaccine caused it. They would have had that heart attack, they would have developed cancer regardless of the vaccine. Other sicknesses, other incidents still happen not because of the vaccine. And so because we have so many people now who've been vaccinated, we have a much better ability to really do scientific analysis and be able to tell whether or not that incidence is more or less or the same as what would be expected. And so I'm confident that the scientists working on this will be able to determine that, and then people can just make informed decisions about vaccination. The other thing about vaccination is, remember, right now we're only offering the mRNA vaccines, and they aren't even under a question for the clotting. And so that's another thing to remind your family members as we move to get them vaccinated. All right, any other questions? All right. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I will continue presenting to you as we hopefully emerge from this pandemic shortly. We have to stay vigilant. We know from other parts of the world, including our neighbor country, Canada, that when you take your eye off the ball, when you decide that the vaccinations are, that we're already there, we're not there yet. We still have to stay vigilant. We still have to wear our masks, right? Physically distance, and wash our hands, and all of those things that are going to keep us safe now and into the future and get us out of this. I'm committed to getting out of this, and I hope that you are too. Until next week.